You know what's weird? You can be totally fine, like genuinely fine, and then you realize what day it is. And suddenly your chest feels heavier, your thoughts get louder, maybe your patience is shorter, or maybe you feel this ache that just doesn't even have words. That happened to me today. Today is my grandma's birthday. She died 13 years ago, and I still felt it. Not just emotionally, but physically, like my body noticed before I did. So, if you've ever felt grief come back out of nowhere on a birthday or an anniversary or Christmas or Mother's Day or just some random Tuesday where you smelt their perfume, I want you to stay with me because today we're talking about something that so many people experience, but almost nobody talks about. Why anniversaries hit so hard, and more importantly, what you can do about it. And we're going to talk about this in a grounded way, psychology, neuroscience, so that you can understand what's happening inside of you. But we're going to talk about this as Catholics because grief isn't a lack of faith. Grief is love. Grief is love with nowhere to land. And the fact that it still shows up doesn't mean that you're failing. It doesn't mean that you're not grieving right or that you're back at the beginning. It just means that the relationship mattered. And if you're watching this on a day that feels tender, well, I'm really glad that you're here. Let's go. Hey friend, and welcome back. Today we're talking about something that's so common, but almost nobody explains in a clear way. Why grief can hit you like a wave on birthdays and anniversaries, even when it's years or even decades later. And I'm not just talking about the anniversary of someone's death. I mean their birthday, your birthday, holidays, Mother's Day, Father's Day, even the random first warm day of spring that suddenly makes your throat tighten. So I'll tell you why I'm even doing this episode today. Today is my grandmother's birthday. She died 13 years ago. And I'm going to be honest, when I realized what day it was, I didn't just think about her. I felt it. Like my body noticed before my brain did. And that's what can be so confusing about grief anniversaries, right? Because you're doing fine, like functioning, productive, okay. And then you realize that date and it's like your nervous system goes, oh, it's that day. And all of a sudden you're more sensitive and you're more tired, you're more emotional. And honestly, sometimes you might feel numb, like you're watching yourself from the outside. So if you've ever had that experience, I want you to know that it's not dramatic. It doesn't mean you're unstable and you're definitely not doing grief wrong. Let me describe what this can look like because I think sometimes people don't realize that they're having an anniversary reaction. They just think, what's wrong with me today? So maybe you wake up and you're fine, and then later you feel a tight chest, a brain fog, tears that come out of nowhere, irritability, like everything and everyone is annoying, or this longing that feels physical. And what's wild is that you may not even be consciously thinking about that person all day. But your body is, your nervous system is, and the truth is, you're not crazy. This is part of grieving. And what's important to understand is that grief doesn't only live in your thoughts, it also lives in your body and in your memory systems and your attachment system. And certain dates act like a cue that brings it all forward again. So in this next part, I'm going to explain what this phenomenon is called and why it happens even years or decades later, and more importantly, what you can do about it. So these days can feel a little less like an emotional ambush and a little more like something that you can move through, even if it's with sadness. So here's where we're going today, and I want to keep it really practical and grounded. Let's start with a definition. In psychology, we use the term called anniversary grief, and it refers to a flare of grief symptoms around meaningful dates connected to a loss. And when I say meaningful dates, I don't just mean the day that the person died. It could be their birthday, your birthday, the anniversary of marriage, a day you became a parent, the first holiday season without them, Mother's Day, Father's Day. You get the sense. And what researchers have found is that these reactions are actually not rare. They're common enough that they show up across the grief literature, and even in recent systematic review work looking at bereavement anniversaries and reactions. This pattern of distress increasing around these dates is consistently described. So if you've ever had that feeling, like I did today, I don't know why this is hitting me so hard right now, and then you realize it's a significant date, then that's not random. That is your brain and your body responding to meaning. So let's address one of the biggest myths that people carry around grief anniversaries. And it's this quiet fear that if something still hurts years later, decades later, it must mean that you're not healing or that somehow you're moving backwards. But that is not how grief works. Grief is not a straight line where you start at devastated and then finally arrive at totally fine forever. It's much more like waves where you have long stretches of stability and then something meaningful pulls the grief forward again. It's more like your heart is revisiting something important and your nervous system is responding to a cue that carries love and memory and meaning. And that is not a problem to fix. It's something to understand, to experience without hiding, and then to move through with tenderness. One of the most helpful ways to understand grief is through the lens of attachment, which we talk about here a lot. Because grief is not only sadness, it's separation distress. When you love someone deeply, your brain and your body don't just store that as a memory. They store that person as a part of your emotional home base. And attachment theory explains that we form bonds that create safety, regulation, and connection. And when that bond is broken by death, the system reacts. John Bowlby, who's one of the foundational voices in attachment theory, described grief as part of our biological attachment system. In other words, grief isn't just a feeling, it's an entire internal process that's just trying to make sense of the fact that someone important is no longer reachable in the same way that they once were. So when a birthday or an anniversary comes around, it's not surprising that the attachment system gets stirred up again, and those dates are connected to the relationship itself. Another framework that I find really helpful here is called the dual process model of grief. And the basic idea is that healthy grief tends to involve movement back and forth between two modes, not a straight line. So one mode is a loss-oriented coping where you're remembering, longing, crying, feeling the absence, letting sadness have its space. And the other mode is a restoration-oriented mode, a resilience mode of coping, where you're functioning, working, parenting, doing daily life, adulting, building routines, slowly learning how to live again. And what this model helps us to understand is that it's normal to oscillate. So you can be doing really well, feeling steady, building a life, and then an anniversary comes along and you swing back into that loss-oriented grief for a time. That doesn't mean that you're stuck. That's actually part of how grief works when it's healthy and moving in a meaningful direction, because it allows you to live while still honoring what you've lost. And this brings us to another important concept that I think is so important, especially for people who feel guilty when they still think about the person who died. In grief psychology, there's a concept called continuing bonds, which simply means that the relationship doesn't disappear. It changes form. You may not be able to talk to them in the way that you used to or that you need, but you still carry them in your memory and in your story and in your inner world, and as Catholics through the communion of saints. Sometimes it shows up as remembering what they would say, or keeping a tradition alive, or feeling connected to them through certain spaces, or recipes, songs, prayers. And from a clinical perspective, this is not something that we need to pathologize. It's often part of how grief integrates over time. You're not refusing to let go in these ways. You're learning how to carry love in a new way. So there's one more psychological piece that I want to name because it explains why anniversaries can feel bigger than just sadness. Grief often forces us into what we call a meaning crisis, because when someone we love dies, we don't only lose the person, we lose the future that we assumed or hoped that we would have with them. We lose the version of ourselves that existed in that relationship. And sometimes we lose a sense of how the world is supposed to work. And that's why anniversaries can bring up questions that aren't always spoken aloud, but you can feel them underneath the surface. Questions like, who am I now? What does life mean without them? Or how could God allow this? And in grief psychology, there's a framework called meaning reconstruction, which emphasizes that part of grieving is rebuilding a sense of meaning after loss, not by forcing a silver lining, but by slowly integrating the reality of what has happened into your life story. So if anniversaries stir up big feelings and big questions, it makes sense, because those dates often pull your attention back to the before and after moment in your life. Now, I want to shift this into the neuroscience side of this, because one of the most confusing things about grief anniversaries is that people will often say, I don't know why I feel like this. I wasn't even thinking about them. And that is exactly the point. Grief is not only a thought process. When a meaningful date comes around, you may notice changes in your energy or your sleep or your appetite, maybe your patience or your ability to focus. And those shifts are not imagined. The nervous system is responding to something emotionally significant, and it's doing what nervous systems do. It prepares you for something that feels hard. So if you've ever felt grief show up like fatigue or tension, heaviness, anxiety, brain fog, or just feeling really emotionally raw, that doesn't just mean that you're overly sensitive. It means your body is participating in the grieving process. Here's a simple way to think about it. The brain doesn't store memories like a filing cabinet. It stores memories in these networks, and emotionally intense experiences get stored with a little extra priority. So when a loss happens, especially if it is traumatic, sudden, or deeply life altering, the brain doesn't only remember the facts, it remembers the feeling, the season, the time of year, if it was cold or warm outside. It remembers the smells, the sounds, the environment, and yes, even the calendar. These all get stored in this neural network. So when a birthday or anniversary shows up, it can act like a cue that activates this network again. It opens it up. And you might not be consciously thinking, this is the anniversary, but your brain recognizes the pattern and your body responds. In a way, it's like the nervous system saying, this is connected to something important, so please pay attention. And this connects to a specific part of the brain that most people have heard of, even if they don't know exactly what it does. The amygdala, or I call her Amy. The amygdala is like the brain's alarm system. You know that if you've hung out here at the Catholic Counseling Institute. It's constantly scanning for what matters: threat, danger, emotional intensity, relational loss. And when the amygdala senses something significant, it can trigger a stress response. That's when you might feel that fight or flight energy, restlessness, irritability, racing thoughts, or you may feel more freeze energy, like numbness, shutdown, heaviness, wanting to withdraw. And it's important to understand that this isn't your character. It's not your willpower. It's not a spiritual weakness. It's the brain doing exactly what it was designed to do, responding to emotional threat or loss. So if you feel dysregulated or on grief anniversaries, it's not because you're doing it wrong. It's because your nervous system is responding to this meaning. Now, let's talk about yearning, because this is one of the most misunderstood parts of grief. People often think that yearning means that you're stuck, or that you're not accepting the reality, or you're not moving forward. But yearning is actually a very normal brain-based response to loss. Neuroscience research suggests that when people are grieving, reminders of the person who died can activate parts of the brain associated with reward and craving, particularly in complicated grief. Almost like the brain is reaching for what it deeply wants but cannot have. In a certain sense, it's like your brain craving connection with that person. When you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. If someone was a source of comfort or safety, love, and connection, then the brain doesn't just stop wanting them because time has passed. So when a birthday or anniversary comes around, yearning can intensify because this date is tied to a relationship and your brain is reaching for connection. And this is not a weakness. This is because you are bonded. Now, this is where I want to bring in something that I think is genuinely reassuring from a clinical perspective. Most bereaved people do not develop complicated grief or pathological grief. In other words, for most people, grief remains painful, but it gradually integrates over time, and they learn how to live again while still carrying love and memory. That matters because sometimes when anniversary grief hits, people can start panicking a little internally and thinking, oh no, does this mean that something's wrong? Does this mean that I'm stuck or I'm not over it? But the reality is that grief waves, especially around these meaningful dates, can happen when grief is progressing in a very healthy direction, even years or decades later. So rather than using the intensity of the anniversary as a measure of whether you're healing or not, it might be more helpful to ask, am I able to return to life again after this wave passes? And I had a few waves today. I also had an appointment and I saw a couple clients and I'm about to go pick up groceries. Am I still connected to people? Am I still able to function overall? Because a wave is not the same thing as being stuck. Now, I'm going to share another statistic that I want to handle carefully because the point's not to scare you, but to validate how real grief is in the body. There was a large Swedish study that looked at bereaved parents, and they found that mothers who had lost a child showed significantly higher risk of mortality during the week of the child's death anniversary, about a 46% increase years later. And again, I'm not coming here to create fear. I'm sharing it because it highlights something that grief researchers and clinicians have been saying for a long time. Grief is not just emotional, it is physiological. It affects the heart, the immune system, sleep, stress hormones, and overall health. I think we've all heard of broken heart syndrome. So if you're feeling wiped out around the anniversary, or you get headaches, or your sleep falls apart, or maybe you get that cold that you've been managing to avoid, there is a reason. Your body is responding to love and loss. So let's put this into real life language again. Anniversary grief can look like sadness. It can also look like numbness. It can look like tears, but it can also look like irritability and impatience. It can look like wanting to talk to the person all day or not wanting to talk about them at all. It can look like fatigue, insomnia, brain fog, appetite changes, and feeling emotionally tender in ways that might surprise you, like filming your YouTube video. And some of the most common experiences I hear, people describe this as a sense of being pulled into memory loops, replaying conversations, replaying the day that they died, replaying the I should have, the thoughts, replaying the if onlys. And this is why I want the rest of this episode to be very practical, because the goal is not to eliminate grief. It's not to edit out the places where you start crying. The goal is to show how to move through it with sadness so that the anniversaries don't feel like they're controlling you. So getting practical, because I don't want this to just be an episode that's explaining what's happening. I want it to actually help you for when those days show up, because I know that if you're human, you will have them too. Here's a simple plan I recommend for grief anniversaries, and I'm going to walk through each step slowly. The order matters because when people try to cope with grief anniversaries, they often start by trying to think their way out of it, or they try to talk themselves into feeling differently, and that usually does not work. Trying not to feel feelings usually does not work. So the plan is, first, name it so that you understand what you're experiencing. Second, to regulate it because your body needs safety before your mind can settle. Third is to lower expectations because these are tender days and you don't need to demand normal productivity for yourself. Fourth, choose connection or solitude, but do it intentionally so that you're not just reacting. The next tool is to create a tiny ritual. And I want to emphasize the word tiny here, much like a tiny chihuahua, because sometimes people hear ritual and they think it has to be something big or emotional or elaborate. It doesn't. Rituals are simply containers for meaning. They give your grief a place to go. And a ritual might look like lighting a candle or sitting quietly for 5 minutes, cooking something that person loved, writing them a letter, visiting a meaningful place or the gravesite, donating to a cause that they cared about, or it might just be listening to a song that reminds you of them one time through. Mariachis tonight. And from a grief psychology perspective, rituals help because they support continuing bonds and meaning making. And Catholics, remember, rituals can be incredibly meaningful for us. Offering a mass intention, praying for them, visiting a cemetery or praying and simply speaking their name in prayer. All of these are ways of honoring love and holding the relationship in a way that fits with your faith. The next tool is one that sounds simple, but can be surprisingly difficult. And it's this: don't argue with the grief. A lot of people try to cope by mentally debating their emotions. They tell themselves something like, I should not feel this way 13 years in, or it's been long enough, or I should be stronger, or I need to get it together. But grief doesn't respond well to pressure. And the truth is that grief doesn't need your permission to exist. It already does. So instead of arguing with it, try to respond with a different kind of language. Like, this makes sense. This is love. This is a wave, and I will move through it. And what happens when you stop arguing is that you can reduce that secondary layer of suffering, which is the self-judgment. The grief may still be there, but it becomes less complicated, so to speak. And this last tool is a practical section. It's to plan for the next day. Because one thing people often don't expect is the emotional aftershock. Sometimes the day itself is manageable, and then the next day you feel tired or foggy, emotionally tender or worn out. And that doesn't mean the day ruined you. It means your system has been working very hard. So the next day, think of it like an emotional recovery day. So basic body care, protein, hydration, sunlight, movement. Give yourself a little extra quiet and support. Try to have a supportive conversation, even if it's brief, and go to bed earlier than usual if you can. Because grief, remember, is not just emotional. It's bodily, it's energetic, and recovery is part of coping wisely. Now I want to talk about the faith piece, because for a lot of us Catholics, grief can come with an extra layer of confusion. Not always from other people, but sometimes just internally. There can be this subtle pressure that says, if I really trusted God, I wouldn't feel this sad, or if I really believed in heaven, I wouldn't still hurt. But grief is not a contradiction of faith. Grief is what happens when love has been transformed and the person is no longer physically present. Faith gives us hope, but it doesn't erase attachment. And I actually think that a Catholic worldview makes room for grief in a way that is very honest, because we don't believe death is normal in this sense of this is how it is supposed to be. We believe that death is real, it's painful, and it ruptures something. We also believe that it's not the final word. So if you're grieving on an anniversary and you find yourself feeling emotional, heavy, tender, this is also not a spiritual failure. It just means that you're loving. One of the most powerful moments in all of Scripture, in my opinion, is also the shortest. Jesus wept. That's it. 2 words. And what I love about that verse is that Jesus doesn't respond to suffering by distancing himself from it. He doesn't respond by spiritual bypassing. He doesn't respond with, well, Lazarus is in a better place, so everybody calm down. He enters into grief. He allows himself to feel the sorrow of loss, separation of body and soul temporarily, even knowing that the resurrection is coming. And I think this is such an important model for us because it shows us that tears and faith are not opposites. They can exist together. And then we have the Beatitudes, which are so countercultural and so deeply compassionate. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Notice that Jesus doesn't say, blessed are those who never feel pain. He says, the mourner is blessed. And the comfort is promised, not because mourning is pleasant, but because God draws close to the brokenhearted. So when grief rises up on a birthday or an anniversary, this verse gives a very different message than one our culture has often given us. It tells you that mourning is not a problem to hide. It's a place where God meets you. And one of the most uniquely Catholic comforts is this: we don't believe that death destroys communion. We believe in the communion of saints. We believe that the dead are still part of the body of Christ. And the Catechism speaks about praying for the dead as a real and meaningful act. Praying because love continues and prayer continues and our connection is not erased, it's transformed. So when you feel grief on an anniversary, you're not only remembering someone who existed in the past, you're remembering someone who still matters, who's still alive spiritually. And prayer becomes one of the ways that we continue that love. One of the reasons I think the Psalms are so healing is because they don't rush you. They don't force meaning too quickly. They don't tell you, look on the bright side. They let you be human in front of God. And if you read them slowly, you'll notice something. The psalmist often starts with pain, sometimes even in protest, and gradually moves towards trust. Not because the pain necessarily disappears, but because God is still there inside of it. So when grief shows up on a birthday or an anniversary, the Psalms give you language for this experience without having to over-explain it. There's a line in the Psalms that I come back to again and again, and it's about people who are grieving. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. And I want you to hear what this is saying. It's not saying that God is close only once you've moved on. It's saying that God draws near to the brokenhearted. So if you feel tender or emotionally worn out around an anniversary, it's not a sign that God is far away. It's often the exact place where he is the closest. And there are 2 other Psalms that I think capture grief anniversaries so perfectly. One is Psalm 56, where it says, you have kept count of my tossings. Put my tears in your bottle. This is such an intimate image. It's the idea that God doesn't just tolerate your grief. He notices it. He remembers it. He holds it with care and honors it, especially on the days when you feel like you're falling apart quietly, internally, while you're still living a normal life on the outside. And then there's Psalm 13, which begins with a very blunt question. How long, O Lord? That's grief. That's the voice of someone who's tired of carrying something heavy. And I think anniversaries often bring that question back up. Again, not because you're regressing, but because that ache has a rhythm to it and certain dates awaken it. So if you don't know how to pray on a grief anniversary, you can borrow words for scripture that God has already given us. And one more piece that I'd like to add, because sometimes people hear Catholic teaching about suffering and it can either be very comforting or it can feel like pressure. The Catholic faith does not ask you to pretend that grief isn't painful. It does not ask you to minimize your loss, and it doesn't ask you to rush through the hardest parts of mourning. What it offers is companionship. It offers a way to carry suffering with Christ, not as a performance, but with communion. And St. John Paul wrote about this in his encyclical Salvifici Doloris, or On the Christian Meaning of Human Suffering. I'll be sure and link it in the comments. And the heart of it is that suffering can be united to Christ in a way that gives it meaning, in a way that makes it redemptive. And this is, again, not because suffering is good, but because God can enter into even the darkest places and bring love into them, bring meaning through them. You can simply bring the reality of your heart to God, and that is enough. Now, I do have to say something practical and responsible here because I am a therapist. So, because grief anniversaries are often painful but manageable, and then sometimes they're not. So if you notice that around anniversaries you become so overwhelmed that you can't function for weeks, or you start having panic attacks, or you feel stuck in intrusive images or trauma symptoms, or your coping becomes more destructive, like an increase in drinking or heavy avoidance or emotional shutdown, those are all signs that extra support could really help. And if you're experiencing hopelessness or thoughts of wanting to disappear, that's a moment to reach out right away. Grief is not something that you have to bear alone, especially when it becomes heavy enough to impair your life. And there are evidence-based approaches for complicated grief and prolonged grief that can be very effective. So here's what I want you to take from this episode. Grief anniversaries don't mean that something's wrong with you. They mean that someone mattered. They mean your nervous system is responding to love, memory, attachment, and meaning. And when you know that, you can stop treating these days like emotional emergencies or things to try to hide and get over quietly and privately. You can start treating them like the tender days that they are, and days that need care and simplicity and steadiness. And over time, many people feel that the pain softens, not because you stop loving, but because love becomes even more integrated into the life that we're living now. And if you want to end with a prayer today, we can keep it simple. Eternal rest grant unto them, O Lord, and let perpetual light shine upon them. May they rest in peace. Amen. And remember, there's always room for you and all of the grief that you carry here on the Catholic Couch.